Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the Ashford, England. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The morning of October 17th, 1850, began like any other in the quiet market town of Ashford. Fog clung to the cobblestone streets, muffling the sounds of merchants preparing their stalls and the distant clatter of horses pulling delivery carts. But as the sun struggled to penetrate the thick gray veil hanging over the town, something terrible was about to be discovered, something that would shatter the tranquility of this respectable community and leave questions that linger to this very day. At number 12, Harrington Street stood a handsome three-story townhouse with freshly painted shutters and a polished brass knocker that gleamed even in the dim morning light. It was the home of Thomas Whitmore, a prosperous textile merchant known throughout the region for his sharp business acumen and his stern, unyielding manner. To the neighbors who passed his home each day, everything appeared orderly, proper, and utterly unremarkable. But behind that elegant facade, something had gone horribly wrong. It was Mrs. Pemberton from the neighboring property who first sensed something amiss. She'd noticed that the curtains in the front parlor remained drawn well past the hour when Mr. Whitmore typically departed for his warehouse. The household, usually a model of punctuality and routine, seemed strangely still. When the morning post arrived and went uncollected on the front step, her concern deepened. After some hesitation, she sent her housemaid to knock on the door and inquire if all was well. The maid returned minutes later, her face pale and her hands trembling. The door had been answered not by the usual servant, but by Miss Eleanor Whitmore herself, the master's stepdaughter. And according to the shaken maid, the young woman had stood in the doorway with an expression that could only be described as unnervingly calm, almost vacant, as she delivered the news that would send shockwaves through the town. "My stepfather has had an accident," she had said, her voice flat and measured. "He is dead." Within the hour, the local constable arrived, followed shortly by Dr. Harrington, the town's physician and acting coroner. What they found inside that respectable home would haunt them for years to come. The body of Thomas Whitmore lay in the parlor, sprawled beside an overturned wing chair near the fireplace. His left arm was extended as though reaching for something, his fingers still curled in a grasping position. His eyes were open, staring at the ornate ceiling with an expression that seemed to capture both surprise and something else, something that looked disturbingly like recognition. But it was the position of the body that immediately struck Dr. Harrington as wrong. Thomas Whitmore was a large man, solid and imposing, yet his body lay at an angle that suggested he hadn't simply fallen from the chair. The overturned furniture sat several feet away, too far to account for the position in which he'd landed. More disturbing still was the slight bruising that the doctor noticed around the deceased man's throat, faint discolorations that could have been shadows in the dim parlor light, but upon closer inspection, appeared too symmetrical, too deliberate to be accidental. The constable's attention, however, was drawn to something else entirely. The parlor door, which opened into the main hallway, had been locked from the inside. The key still sat in the lock. The windows were latched shut, their heavy velvet curtains drawn. There was no sign of forced entry, no indication that anyone from outside the household could have accessed this room. Whatever had happened to Thomas Whitmore had occurred in a sealed chamber, with only the members of his own household present in the building. And throughout the initial examination, through the arrival of authorities and the whispered conversations of shocked neighbors gathering in the street outside, Eleanor Whitmore remained eerily composed. She sat in the drawing room, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her morning dress already donned as though she had been prepared for this moment. She answered questions when asked, her responses brief and precise, but her eyes held a distance that unsettled everyone who looked into them. It was as though she were watching events unfold from somewhere far away, detached from the horror that had descended upon her home. The constable, a practical man named Henderson who had served the town for nearly 20 years, found himself deeply troubled. He had seen death in many forms, accidents, illnesses, even the occasional violence that erupted in taverns or domestic disputes. But there was something about this scene that didn't fit neatly into any category he recognized. The body, the locked room, the strange calmness of the stepdaughter who had discovered it all. These elements combined to create a picture that was both incomplete and profoundly disturbing. As the fog finally began to lift from Ashford streets that afternoon, casting pale sunlight across the townhouse on Harrington Street, one question hung in the air, unspoken but present in every mind. Was Thomas Whitmore's death truly an accident, as his stepdaughter claimed? Or had something far darker occurred within those locked parlor walls? Something that would require looking beyond the surface of this seemingly respectable household to understand. The investigation was about to begin, and what it would uncover would force the entire town to confront uncomfortable truths about the lives lived behind closed doors, about the secrets that families kept, and about the desperate measures taken by those who found themselves trapped with no escape. To understand what happened in that parlor on that fog-shrouded October morning, we must first understand the man who died there, and the family he had created through marriage just 3 years earlier. Thomas Whitmore had come to Ashford in 1842, arriving with letters of recommendation and enough capital to establish himself as a merchant of fine textiles. He rented warehouse space near the canal, cultivated relationships with manufacturers in the northern mill towns, and quickly built a reputation as a shrewd but honest businessman. He was not a warm man, by any account. Those who dealt with him professionally described him as exacting in his standards and unforgiving of errors. He kept precise ledgers, demanded punctual deliveries, and drove hard bargains with both suppliers and customers. But in the commerce-minded world of Victorian England, these were not considered flaws. They were the marks of a serious man, a man who understood the value of discipline and order. In a town like Ashford, where respectability was measured by one's ability to maintain appearances and meet obligations, Thomas Whitmore was considered quite respectable indeed. In 1847, at the age of 42, he decided it was time to marry. His choice surprised some in the community, not because the bride was unsuitable, but because Thomas Whitmore had never shown the slightest interest in domestic life or companionship. Yet he approached marriage as he approached business, practically, methodically, and with clear objectives in mind. He needed a well-run household. He needed the social legitimacy that came with a wife. And perhaps, though he never stated this explicitly, he needed the appearance of normalcy that a family provided. His bride was Mrs. Catherine Ashford, a widow of modest means who had been living in reduced circumstances since her first husband's death 4 years earlier. She was 36 years old, still handsome despite the hardships she had endured, and she came with a daughter from her first marriage, Eleanor, then 15 years old. For Catherine, the marriage represented salvation from a precarious financial situation. For her daughter, it meant security and perhaps the opportunity for a better future than a widow's daughter could typically expect. The wedding was a quiet affair, conducted with more practicality than romance. Thomas Whitmore moved his new wife and stepdaughter into the townhouse on Harrington Street, hired appropriate servants to maintain the household, and established the routines that would govern their daily lives. He expected order, cleanliness, and silence. He expected his meals served promptly, his household accounts kept meticulously, and his privacy respected. In return, he provided financial stability and the protection of his name. To the outside world, the arrangement seemed perfectly reasonable. Neighbors saw a well-maintained home, a wife who appeared adequately provided for, and a stepdaughter who dressed appropriately and attended church with suitable regularity. Thomas Whitmore fulfilled his duties as a husband and stepfather in all the ways that Victorian society measured such things. He provided materially. He maintained respectability. He ensured his household reflected well upon his position in the community. But even in those early months, there were whispers. Quiet observations shared over tea or in the market square, never quite rising to the level of gossip but present nonetheless. The servants from the Whitmore household were noted to be unusually reserved, even for people in service who understood the importance of discretion. Catherine Whitmore, though always properly dressed and mannered, seemed to have aged considerably in the first year of her second marriage. And Eleanor, the stepdaughter, had transformed from a bright-eyed girl with a ready smile into a young woman who kept her gaze lowered and spoke only when directly addressed. Mrs. Pemberton, whose home shared a wall with the Whitmore residence, sometimes heard voices through the plaster, never quite loud enough to make out words but enough to sense the tone. Sharp commands, long silences, occasionally something that might have been crying, though she could never be certain. But these were not the sort of things one discussed openly, not in a community that valued propriety above all else. What happened within a man's home was his own business, protected by the thick walls of domestic privacy that Victorian society carefully maintained. Thomas Whitmore attended his business regularly, maintained his accounts impeccably, and contributed to civic causes with appropriate generosity. He served on the board of the local Merchants' Association. He was seen in church each Sunday, his family arranged beside him in their pew. By every measurable standard, he was exactly what he appeared to be, a successful, respectable, stern but fair man who had done his duty by marrying a widow and providing for her and her daughter. And yet, in the months leading up to that October morning, something had shifted. Those who paid attention noticed that Eleanor, now 18 years old, had become even more withdrawn. She rarely left the house except for necessary errands or church attendance. Her mother, Catherine, had developed a nervous habit of glancing toward her husband before answering even simple questions, as though seeking permission to speak. The household staff changed with unusual frequency, maids and housekeepers leaving service with tight-lipped explanations about seeking positions elsewhere. The Reverend Mills, who made pastoral calls to the prominent families in his parish, later recalled feeling uneasy during his visits to the Whitmore home. There was nothing he could point to specifically, no obvious discord or impropriety, but the atmosphere in that house felt heavy, he would say, like air before a thunderstorm. The conversations were stiff and formal. The smiles seemed painted on. And always, there was Thomas Whitmore at the center of it all, controlling the flow of conversation, deciding who would speak and when, maintaining his domain with an iron grip wrapped in the velvet glove of respectability. So when the news spread through Ashford that Thomas Whitmore had been found dead in his parlor, the initial response was shock. A man so vigorous, so in command of his world, suddenly gone. But beneath the shock, in the quiet spaces where people allow themselves to think uncharitable thoughts, there was something else. A sense that perhaps this seemingly solid household had been built on more fragile foundations than anyone had realized. A wondering about what truly occurred behind those freshly painted shutters and that polished brass door knocker. The investigation would soon peel back the respectable facade that Thomas Whitmore had so carefully constructed, and what lay beneath would prove far more disturbing than anyone in that quiet market town could have imagined. 3 days after the discovery of Thomas Whitmore's body, the coroner's inquest convened in the town hall. These proceedings, common in cases of sudden or unexplained death, were designed to determine the cause and manner of death through testimony and examination of evidence. Constable Henderson had requested the inquest despite the family's preference for a quick burial and closure. Something about the scene troubled him, and he wanted answers before Thomas Whitmore was laid to rest in the churchyard. The inquest room was packed with curious townspeople, all of whom had managed to find reasons why their presence was necessary. Dr. Harrington, serving as coroner, sat at a long table facing the assembled crowd, his medical notes spread before him. To his right sat the jury, 12 men of property and standing who would ultimately determine the verdict. And in the front row, dressed in deep mourning black, sat Catherine and Eleanor Whitmore, their faces partially obscured by heavy veils. Dr. Harrington began by describing the medical examination of the body. Thomas Whitmore had been a robust man of 45 years, showing no signs of the diseases or conditions that typically felled men his age. His heart appeared sound. His lungs were clear. There was no evidence of apoplexy or seizure. The initial conclusion had been that perhaps he had simply fallen, struck his head, and died from the trauma. But upon more careful examination, complications emerged. The bruising around the neck, which Dr. Harrington had noted at the scene, had become more pronounced in the hours after death. What had appeared as faint shadows now revealed themselves as distinct marks, pressure points consistent with someone's hands pressing against the throat. They were not severe enough to indicate strangulation as the cause of death, but they suggested a struggle, a physical confrontation of some kind. More curious still was the position of these marks. They were higher on the throat than one would expect if the victim had been standing, and the angle suggested the pressure had come from someone facing him, someone shorter, pressing upward. Then there was the matter of the head wound. Thomas Whitmore had sustained a significant injury to the back of his skull, a fracture that had likely contributed to his death. But the location and nature of this wound raised questions. If he had fallen backward from the chair, one would expect to find blood or tissue on the chair itself, or on the hearthstone behind it. Neither showed any such evidence. The wound was consistent with his head striking the floor, yet the body's position suggested he had fallen forward, not back. Dr. Harrington concluded his medical testimony with careful, measured words. "Based on my examination," he stated, "I cannot definitively rule this death as accidental. The physical evidence suggests a sequence of events that remains unclear. There are indications of a physical altercation or struggle occurring shortly before death. The exact cause of the fatal injury cannot be determined with certainty, but it appears that Mr. Whitmore sustained the head wound after some kind of confrontation." A murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not the straightforward accident they had expected to hear confirmed. Constable Henderson was called next, and he described the scene as he had found it: the locked door, the overturned chair, the positioned body, and most significantly, the absence of any sign of intrusion or involvement by anyone outside the household. "The key to the parlor was in the lock on the inside," Henderson emphasized. "The windows were latched from within. The only people in the house at the time of death were Mrs. Whitmore, Miss Eleanor Whitmore, and 2 servants, a housemaid named Sarah and a cook named Mrs. Bradley. According to all accounts, Mr. Whitmore had retired to the parlor after breakfast, as was his custom. He preferred to work on his accounts in privacy before departing for his warehouse. No one entered or left the house that morning, until Miss Eleanor discovered her stepfather's body just before noon." The constable paused, consulting his notes. Miss Eleanor stated that she had knocked on the parlor door to inform her stepfather that his lunch was prepared. Receiving no answer, and noting that the door was unlocked, contrary to his usual practice of locking it while he worked, She entered and found him as we later discovered him. She immediately called for her mother and sent the maid for help. Eleanor Whitmore was then called to give her testimony. She rose from her seat with deliberate slowness, as though each movement required conscious effort. When she lifted her veil, the crowd could see that her face was pale and composed, showing neither tears nor any obvious sign of distress. If anything, she appeared detached, as though she were speaking about events that had happened to someone else entirely. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and steady. "I found my stepfather lying on the floor beside his chair. The chair was overturned. I knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. I touched his hand and it was already cold. I called for my mother, and we sent Sarah to fetch the constable and Dr. Harrington." "Did you notice anything else unusual about the room?" the coroner asked. Eleanor's gaze remained fixed on a point somewhere above the jury's heads. The account books he had been reviewing were still open on the side table. His pen had fallen to the floor. It appeared as though he had risen suddenly from his chair, perhaps feeling unwell, and then fallen. "And you heard nothing? No cry for help, no sound of a fall?" "I heard nothing. I was in the upstairs sitting room with my mother, reviewing household accounts. The parlor is at the opposite end of the house, and my stepfather preferred absolute quiet when he was working. No one would have disturbed him." But here was where the first significant inconsistency emerged. The housemaid, Sarah, when called to testify, offered a different account. She had been working in the hallway, she said, polishing the brass fixtures and dusting the portraits. This was near enough to the parlor that she should have heard any significant disturbance. And indeed, she had heard something, raised voices, she said, coming from the parlor around mid-morning. She couldn't make out the words, but there had been at least two voices, one of them unmistakably male. "Are you certain of this?" Dr. Harrington pressed. "You heard Mr. Whitmore speaking with someone in the parlor?" "Yes." Sarah nodded, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "Yes, sir. I heard the master's voice, quite sharp and angry-like, and another voice quieter but definitely there. I thought perhaps Miss Eleanor had gone in to speak with him about something, though that wasn't usual. The master didn't like to be disturbed when he was working on his ledgers." Eleanor was recalled to address this contradiction. Did she, at any point that morning, enter the parlor to speak with her stepfather? "No," Eleanor replied, her expression unchanged. "I did not enter the parlor until I found him dead." "Then who was speaking with your stepfather?" the coroner asked. "I cannot say. Perhaps Sarah was mistaken about what she heard." "Yes." But Sarah stood by her testimony, insisting she had definitely heard two voices in conversation, if not argument. The timeline, too, was problematic. If the voices were heard around mid-morning, and Eleanor claimed to have discovered the body just before noon, what had happened in those intervening hours? If Thomas Whitmore had been injured or killed during the conversation Sarah overheard, why had no one checked on him earlier? And if he had been alive after that conversation, what had occurred afterward to cause his death? The newspapers covering the inquest seized upon these inconsistencies with relish. The Ashford Chronicle, in its edition published 2 days after the inquest began, posed the questions that everyone was thinking. What truly occurred in the locked parlor of the Whitmore residence? If Miss Eleanor Whitmore did not speak with her stepfather that morning, then who did? And why does her account differ so markedly from that of the household servant? Public opinion in the town began to divide. Some believed Eleanor was simply in shock, that her memory of that morning was fragmented by trauma. Others noted her unusual calmness, her precise and careful answers, her seeming lack of emotion. Still others pointed out that a young woman of good family, living in a respectable household, would hardly be capable of violence against her stepfather, no matter how stern his manner. But the physical evidence continued to trouble those examining it closely. The bruising on the throat, though not sufficient to have caused death, indicated physical contact of an aggressive nature. The head wound, while potentially caused by a fall, had characteristics that made a simple accident questionable. And the locked room itself presented a puzzle. If Thomas Whitmore had been attacked or confronted by someone outside the household, how had they entered and exited a sealed room? As the inquest continued through its second day, tension mounted. Dr. Harrington was thorough and methodical, calling witness after witness to establish a timeline of that morning's events. But with each testimony, the picture became less clear rather than more so. The servants offered fragments of information, sounds heard, routine activities observed, but nothing that definitively explained what had happened in those final hours of Thomas Whitmore's life. And through it all, Eleanor Whitmore sat in the front row, her expression never wavering, her composure never breaking. She answered every question put to her with the same measured calmness, neither elaborating beyond what was asked nor showing any sign of the distress that one would expect from a young woman who had discovered her stepfather's body. It was this composure, perhaps more than any physical evidence, that began to turn suspicion toward her. The question that hung over the inquest, unspoken but present in every mind, was becoming impossible to ignore. Had Eleanor Whitmore killed her stepfather? And if so, what could possibly have driven a young woman of seemingly respectable character to such a desperate and violent act? The answers, when they began to emerge, would come not from the official proceedings, but from the whispered testimonies of servants who had lived within the Whitmore household and had witnessed what occurred behind its closed doors. On the third day of the inquest, the proceedings took a turn that would transform the entire nature of the investigation. Mrs. Bradley, the cook who had served in the Whitmore household for nearly 2 years, requested to provide additional testimony. She was a stout woman in her 50s, with the weathered hands of someone who had spent decades in service. When she took her seat before the coroner, her face was etched with an internal struggle, the conflict between a servant's duty to discretion and a conscience that could no longer remain silent. Dr. Harrington noted her obvious distress and spoke gently. "Mrs. Bradley, you've already provided testimony about the morning of Mr. Whitmore's death. Is there something additional you wish to share with this inquest?" The cook's hands twisted in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was low but steady. "Sir, I've been in service for 30 years. I know my place, and I know the importance of keeping household matters private. But I cannot, in good conscience, remain silent about what I witnessed in that house. Not when a young woman's fate may hang in the balance." A profound silence fell over the courtroom, every eye fixed upon Mrs. Bradley as she continued. "The Whitmore household was not a happy one, sir. From the very beginning, there was something wrong about it. Mr. Whitmore was a demanding master. That's not uncommon, and I've worked for demanding people before. But his demands went beyond what was proper. He controlled every aspect of that household with a grip that left no room for breath." She paused, gathering her courage. "He dictated what Mrs. Whitmore could wear, whom she could visit, even what correspondence she could receive. He read her letters before she did. He questioned her about every penny spent on household expenses, but it was his treatment of Miss Eleanor that troubled me most deeply." The coroner leaned forward. "Please elaborate, Mrs. Bradley. What was the nature of his treatment of his stepdaughter?" "He was obsessed with her, sir. That's the only word I can use. He watched her constantly. He questioned her movements, her activities, whom she spoke with. When she tried to accept an invitation to tea with a neighbor's daughter, he forbade it, saying she had household duties to attend to. When she expressed interest in attending a lecture at the assembly rooms, he declared it inappropriate. Gradually, over the months, he isolated her from everyone outside that house." Mrs. Bradley's voice grew stronger as she continued. He insisted on taking his evening tea alone with Miss Alina, sending Mrs. Whitmore upstairs on various pretexts. He required that Miss Alina serve his meals personally, even though that was properly the housemaid's duty. And the way he looked at her, the cook paused, struggling with how to articulate something that existed beyond the realm of proper Victorian discourse. "It wasn't the way a father looks at a daughter, sir. It made my blood run cold." A shocked murmur rippled through the courtroom. This was dangerous testimony, speaking to matters that polite society preferred to pretend didn't exist. But Mrs. Bradley pressed on, as though having breached the wall of silence, she was determined to tell everything she knew. The household was ruled by fear. Miss Alina became increasingly withdrawn. She stopped singing, which she used to do while arranging flowers or working on her embroidery. She startled at every unexpected sound. And Mrs. Whitmore, that poor woman aged years in months. She knew something was terribly wrong, but what could she do? She had no means of her own. If she left her husband, she would be destitute and her daughter with her. They were trapped, sir, completely trapped. The coroner asked the question that everyone was thinking. "Mrs. Bradley, did you witness any specific incident that would suggest improper conduct on Mr. Whitmore's part?" The cook hesitated. "Nothing I could testify to with absolute certainty, sir, but there were signs. Miss Alina would emerge from those private evening teas with her stepfather looking shaken and pale. Several times I heard her crying in her room late at night. And once," she stopped, clearly debating whether to continue. "Once, about 6 months before Mr. Whitmore's death, I came upon Miss Alina in the scullery. She was washing dishes, which wasn't her task, but she said she needed something to occupy her hands. Her sleeves were rolled up and I noticed bruises on her forearms, finger marks as though someone had gripped her forcefully. When she saw me looking, she quickly pulled her sleeves down and left the room." Another witness corroborated this testimony. Sarah, the housemaid, was recalled and asked directly about the household atmosphere. With the cook's testimony having broken the seal of silence, Sarah felt emboldened to speak more freely than she had in her initial appearance. "I only worked there for 4 months, sir," Sarah said. "I left service in August, 2 months before Mr. Whitmore's death. I couldn't bear it any longer. The tension in that house was suffocating. Mr. Whitmore had rules about everything, which rooms we could clean at which times, how silently we had to move through the hallways, how we were to address Miss Alina only when absolutely necessary." She described incidents that painted a picture of a household operating under a regime of control and surveillance. Mr. Whitmore checked the servants' work constantly, finding fault with minor imperfections. He questioned them about everything they had seen or heard. He forbade them from forming any kind of friendly relationship with his stepdaughter, saying it was inappropriate for servants to become familiar with family members. "But the worst was the late-night disturbances," Sarah continued. "Several times I woke to hear footsteps in the hallway outside my attic room, heavy footsteps unmistakably male. They would pause outside Miss Alina's door. Sometimes I heard voices, low, urgent whispers. Once I heard what sounded like Miss Alina saying, 'No, please,' followed by silence. I was terrified, sir. I didn't know what to do. A housemaid can't accuse her master of impropriety without proof, and I had none. But I couldn't stay in that house any longer." A previous housemaid was located and brought to testify. Margaret Wright had worked for the Whitmore household during the first year of the marriage. Her testimony added another layer to the emerging picture. She described how Mr. Whitmore's behavior toward his stepdaughter had evolved over time. Initially, he had simply been strict and distant, but gradually his attention toward Alina had intensified. He began finding excuses to be in whatever room she occupied, Margaret testified. If she was reading in the drawing room, he would suddenly need to retrieve a document from the desk there. If she was arranging flowers in the dining room, he would appear to inspect the table settings. At first, I thought nothing of it. But it became constant, this surveillance. Miss Alina noticed it too. She began moving from room to room, trying to avoid him, but he always seemed to know where she was. Margaret described the breaking point that led to her departure. One evening, I was bringing tea to the drawing room. The door was partially open, and I heard Mr. Whitmore speaking to Miss Alina. His voice was soft, almost tender, but the words, she shook her head. He was telling her that she reminded him of her mother when she was young, but that she was more beautiful. He said that she should be grateful for the security he provided, that she owed him respect and affection. Miss Alina's voice, when she replied, was trembling. She said she was grateful, but she wished to retire to her room. He told her to sit down, that they weren't finished talking. I backed away from the door, sir. I was horrified. The next day, I gave my notice. Mrs. Whitmore asked me why I was leaving, and I could see in her eyes that she already knew. She didn't try to convince me to stay. She just looked terribly sad and said she understood. As these testimonies accumulated, the courtroom atmosphere shifted palpably. The question was no longer simply about what had happened on the morning of October 17th. The question now encompassed months of psychological torment, of a young woman trapped in a household where the very person who should have protected her had instead become a source of fear, and it was increasingly clear, something far worse. But this created a profound dilemma for the inquest, and for Victorian society more broadly. Even if everything these servants testified to was true, and many in the courtroom found their accounts credible, what did it mean for the investigation into Thomas Whitmore's death? If Alina had killed her stepfather, was it murder? Or was it self-defense? And if it was self-defense, how could that be proven when the nature of the threat was something that could not be spoken about directly in a public forum? The law, as it existed in 1850, provided little framework for understanding or adjudicating such cases. A man's authority over his household was nearly absolute. Short of extreme and provable physical violence, there was virtually no legal recourse for women or children suffering abuse within the home. And certain forms of abuse, particularly those of a sexual nature, were so deeply buried beneath layers of social taboo that they could barely be named, let alone prosecuted. Mrs. Catherine Whitmore was called to testify about her own observations of her husband's behavior toward her daughter. The courtroom watched as she approached the witness chair, her movements slow and defeated. When she lifted her veil, her face showed the toll of the past weeks, or perhaps the past 3 years. She looked far older than her 39 years. Mrs. Whitmore, Dr. Harrington began gently, we've heard testimony about the atmosphere in your household. Can you speak to the relationship between your late husband and your daughter? Catherine's hands trembled as she clutched a handkerchief. My husband was a difficult man, she said quietly. He had very specific ideas about how things should be done, and he expected absolute obedience. But he provided for us, which is more than we had after my first husband died. I tried to be grateful. And his behavior toward your daughter specifically. Yes. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. I knew he paid particular attention to Alina. At first, I told myself he was simply taking his responsibilities as a stepfather seriously. But as time went on, I could see that Alina was becoming increasingly distressed. She stopped smiling. She became thin and pale. She would flinch when he entered a room. Did you confront your husband about your concerns? Once, Catherine whispered. About 8 months ago. I asked him why he required Alina to take tea with him alone each evening. He became very angry. He said that I was being ridiculous, that he was simply trying to educate his stepdaughter in proper conversation and manners. He said that if I questioned his authority in his own household, I could leave, but Alina would remain, as she was under his guardianship until she reached her majority or married. I never raised the subject again. This last statement hung in the air like a condemnation. Catherine Whitmore had known something was wrong, but fear and powerlessness had kept her silent. It was a situation that many women of her era would have understood all too well, the impossible choice between confronting a powerful man and maintaining the security that his protection provided. The inquest was forced to recess for 2 days to allow the coroner and jury to consider the implications of these testimonies. The newspapers, no longer constrained by the need to wait for official proceedings, published sensational accounts that danced around explicit accusations while making the implications clear to anyone reading between the lines. What transpired in the Whitmore household? Demanded the Ashford Chronicle. Servants speak of fear and inappropriate attention, a stepfather's obsession with his young ward, a mother unable to protect her own child. These revelations cast the death of Thomas Whitmore in an entirely new light. If Miss Alina Whitmore did indeed cause her stepfather's demise, can we truly call it murder when she may have been defending herself from unspeakable degradation? But not everyone was sympathetic. Other voices argued that servant testimony was inherently unreliable, that domestic workers often exaggerated or misinterpreted innocent actions to create drama. Some suggested that Alina Whitmore, facing questions about her stepfather's death, had cleverly manipulated the narrative to portray herself as a victim rather than a perpetrator. The Reverend Mills, in his Sunday sermon, spoke carefully about the case without naming names. "We must be cautious," he warned, "not to allow sympathy for suffering to blind us to the commandment against taking human life. Even if someone has been wronged, we cannot condone revenge. Justice belongs to God and to the lawful authorities he has established, not to individuals acting in passion or desperation." Yet even as he spoke these words, the Reverend must have known how hollow they sounded to anyone who understood the reality of women's powerlessness in Victorian society. What justice could Alina have sought through lawful authorities? What complaint could she have made that would have been taken seriously, let alone acted upon? The law, like society itself, was constructed to protect men's authority over their households, not to question it. As the inquest prepared to resume, one question dominated every conversation in Ashford. What had truly driven Alina Whitmore to what now seemed the increasingly likely conclusion that she had killed her stepfather? And whatever the truth might be, how could justice possibly be served in a case where the crime and the victim's own actions were so impossibly entangled? The answers would come from an unexpected source. Words that Alina herself had written, hidden away in a place where she thought no one would ever find them. On the 5th day of the inquest, Constable Henderson presented evidence that would prove to be the most damning or the most exculpatory, depending on one's perspective. During a thorough search of the Whitmore residence, conducted as part of the investigation, he had discovered something hidden beneath the floorboards in Alina's bedroom. Wrapped in cloth and concealed in the narrow space between the joists, lay several torn pages covered in feminine handwriting. "These appear to be pages from a diary or personal journal," Henderson explained to the court. "They were deliberately concealed, not simply misplaced. The pages are not sequential. They appear to have been torn from different dates, but what they contain is deeply troubling." Dr. Harrington examined the pages carefully before reading selected passages aloud. He prefaced his reading with a warning. "What you are about to hear contains distressing content. I will read only those portions relevant to establishing Miss Whitmore's state of mind in the period before her stepfather's death." The first entry was dated March 15, 1850, 7 months before Thomas Whitmore's death. I can no longer bear his presence. Every evening he summons me to his study for what he calls conversation, but his words are poison. He speaks of affection and duty in the same breath, as though the two are interchangeable. He tells me I am beautiful, that I should be grateful for his attention, that other men would not be so patient or generous. Patient with what? Generous about what? I dare not ask, for I fear I already know the answer. Mother cannot help me. She is as trapped as I am. I have nowhere to go, no one to turn to. The walls of this house are my prison, and he holds the only key. The courtroom was absolutely silent as Dr. Harrington paused before continuing to the next entry, dated May 3rd. He came to my room again last night. I had locked the door, but he has a master key. He said he only wished to ensure I was well, but he stayed for nearly an hour, sitting on the edge of my bed, speaking in that soft voice that makes my skin crawl. He touched my hand, then my hair, saying how lovely I looked in my nightdress. I could not move, could not speak. I felt frozen like a rabbit before a fox. When he finally left, I pushed my wardrobe against the door, though I know it will do no good. He can enter whenever he wishes. This is his house, and I am his property, like the furniture, like the servants. Another page, undated but clearly from the summer, based on a reference to the heat. I have begun to think about death, not in a fearful way, but almost as a friend. What would it be like to simply not exist anymore? To escape this constant vigilance, this perpetual dread. But if I die, what becomes of Mother? He would be free to remarry, to trap another woman, another daughter. The thought of someone else suffering as I have suffered is unbearable. Sometimes I think the only solution is for him to die. God forgive me for thinking such things, but I cannot stop the thoughts from coming. If he were gone, we would be free. Mother would have her widow's portion. I would be released from this nightmare. It is a sin to wish for someone's death, I know this. But which is the greater sin, wishing for his death, or allowing the degradation to continue? The entries grew more desperate as the dates progressed. One from August described an incident where Thomas Whitmore had found her reading in the garden and had insisted she come inside, saying the sun was damaging her complexion and that he preferred to see her indoors where he could properly appreciate her beauty. Another from September detailed how he had begun insisting she help him prepare for bed, dismissing the servant who normally attended to such tasks, saying he wanted his stepdaughter to show him the proper respect and care a father deserved. But he is not my father, the entry concluded. He is a monster who wears the mask of respectability, and I am drowning, slowly drowning, with no hope of rescue. The final entry discovered in the cache was dated October 10th, exactly 1 week before Thomas Whitmore's death. I cannot allow this to continue. Tomorrow he intends to take me with him on a business trip to London. Mother is to remain here. We would be staying in a hotel for 3 nights. When he told me this plan, he smiled in a way that made my blood run cold. He said it was time I learned how to conduct myself properly in society, that he would teach me everything I needed to know. I understand his meaning perfectly. I have reached the end of what I can endure. There is unbearable shame in what he intends, but there would be even greater shame in allowing it to happen without resistance. A sin must be answered with another sin. I pray God will forgive me for what I must do, or I pray he will understand that sometimes survival requires desperate measures. I am not brave enough to end my own life, but perhaps I am brave enough to end his. The courtroom erupted. Several women in the gallery were openly weeping. Men shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to process what they had heard. These pages laid bare a reality that Victorian society worked tirelessly to pretend didn't exist: the sexual exploitation of young women by men in positions of authority over them, the complete powerlessness of those who suffered such abuse, and the desperation that could drive someone to contemplate murder as the only escape. Eleanor Whitmore, still seated in the front row, showed no reaction to the reading of her own words. Her face remained pale and composed, her hands folded in her lap, as though the diary entries concerned someone else entirely. This detachment, which had earlier been interpreted as cold indifference, now appeared more like profound dissociation, the psychological response of someone who had endured trauma beyond their capacity to process. Dr. Harrington called Eleanor back to the witness chair. His manner toward her had noticeably softened. "Miss Whitmore," he began carefully, "can you confirm that these diary entries are in your handwriting?" "They are," Eleanor replied without emotion. "Why did you conceal them beneath the floorboards?" "Because I could not risk my stepfather finding them. He searched my room regularly. He read any correspondence I received. The only way to maintain any privacy of thought was to hide my writings where he would never think to look. In your entry from October 10th, you wrote that a sin must be answered with another sin. Can you explain what you meant by that?" For the first time since the inquest began, Eleanor's composure cracked slightly. Her voice, when she answered, was barely above a whisper. "I meant that if I allowed what he intended to happen, I would be complicit in my own degradation. That would be a sin against myself, against God's image in which I was created. To prevent that sin, I would have to commit another, the sin of taking a life." "Are you confessing to killing your stepfather, Miss Whitmore?" The entire courtroom held its breath. Eleanor was silent for a long moment, her gaze distant, as though looking at something far beyond the walls of the inquest room. "I am confessing," she finally said, "that I wished him dead. I am confessing that I could no longer endure living under his authority. I am confessing that I saw no way out of my situation except through his death. Whether I caused that death, whether my wishes somehow manifested into action, I can no longer separate what I wanted to happen from what actually occurred. The morning he died, I felt as though I were watching events unfold from outside my own body. I remember being in the parlor. I remember his hands on me. I remember saying no. And then I remember nothing clearly until I was standing over his body, and he was finally silent and still. It was not quite a confession, but it was close enough to confirm what many had already concluded. Eleanor Whitmore had killed her stepfather, whether through deliberate action or through a desperate struggle that had ended in his death. But understanding that she had killed him and determining what should be done about it were two entirely different matters. The diary entries had transformed the case completely. This was no longer a simple question of murder versus accident. This was now a case that forced everyone to confront the darkest aspects of Victorian family life: the absolute authority of men over their households, the vulnerability of women and children within that structure, and the complete absence of legal protection for those suffering abuse behind closed doors. Dr. Harrington faced an unprecedented dilemma. The physical evidence, the servant testimonies, and now Eleanor's own words all pointed toward the conclusion that she had caused her stepfather's death. But the context in which that death occurred, the months of psychological torment, the increasingly predatory behavior, the imminent threat of sexual assault, created a situation that defied the simple legal categories of murder or manslaughter. In 1850, there was no legal framework for understanding what we would now call domestic violence or sexual abuse. There was no concept of psychological self-defense. The law recognized only immediate physical threat as justification for taking a life, and even then, women's claims of self-defense were viewed with deep suspicion. Eleanor's situation, trapped in a household where her stepfather held complete legal authority over her, facing a threat that was more psychological than immediately physical until that final confrontation. simply did not fit into any recognized legal defense. The inquest would need to determine not just what had happened in that locked parlor, but how a legal system designed to protect male authority could possibly address a case where that very authority had been the source of the crime. It was a question that Victorian England was profoundly unprepared to answer, and the struggle to find that answer would reveal just how deeply the foundations of injustice were embedded in the structures of law and society. As the court adjourned for the day, Alina was taken into custody for her own protection. The diary entries had made her a figure of intense public interest, and the authorities feared what might happen if she remained in her home. Some in the town viewed her as a murderess who deserved hanging. Others saw her as a victim who had done what was necessary to survive. The divide in public opinion reflected a larger crack forming in the foundation of Victorian moral certainty, a crack that would only widen as the case progressed toward its inevitable and unsatisfying conclusion. The revelation that would ultimately crack open the truth about Thomas Whitmore came from an unexpected source, and from a location more than 60 miles from Ashford. In the week following the disclosure of Alina's diary entries, the newspapers had carried the story far beyond the local community. The case had captured public attention across the region, with its elements of respectability, hidden depravity, and the moral questions it raised about authority and justice. It was in the town of Millbridge, a manufacturing center to the north, that a tradesman named Robert Hastings read the newspaper account of the inquest with growing recognition. He sought out the local magistrate and requested that information be forwarded to the authorities in Ashford. What he had to say, he insisted, was crucial to understanding who Thomas Whitmore had truly been. When Constable Henderson received the correspondence and traveled to Millbridge to interview Hastings, he found himself listening to a story that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Robert Hastings and his wife, Martha, had employed a young housemaid named Jane Burton 5 years earlier, in 1845. She had been 15 years old, an orphan who had been in service since childhood, and she had come to them with a character reference from her previous employer, a merchant named Thomas Whitmore. Jane was a sweet girl, Martha Hastings explained, her voice heavy with old sorrow. Quiet, hardworking, eager to please. She seemed grateful to have a position with us. But after about 3 months, we noticed she was becoming increasingly distressed. She startled easily. She had nightmares that woke the entire household with her screaming. When I asked her what was troubling her, she initially said nothing. But eventually, she broke down and told me a story that horrified me. Jane had worked for Thomas Whitmore for nearly a year before coming to the Hastings household. During that time, Whitmore had subjected her to a pattern of escalating abuse. It had begun with inappropriate comments about her appearance, progressed to unwanted touching, and ultimately to late-night visits to her attic room where he had forced himself upon her. She had been terrified, ashamed, and convinced that no one would believe her if she spoke out against her employer. When she could bear it no longer, she had gone to him and begged for a character reference so she could seek another position, Martha continued. He had given her an excellent reference, which is how she came to us. But he had also told her that if she ever spoke about what had occurred in his household, he would destroy her reputation and ensure she never worked in service again. He said no one would believe a housemaid over a respected merchant, and he was probably right. The Hastings family had tried to help Jane. They had kept her in their employment, given her lighter duties, tried to help her recover from her trauma. But the damage had been too deep. Jane had become pregnant, whether from the assaults she had suffered in Whitmore's house or from some later incident. They could never be certain. In desperation and shame, she had attempted to end the pregnancy using methods that were whispered about among desperate women. The attempt had gone tragically wrong, and Jane Burton had died of blood poisoning in 1846, at just 16 years old. On her deathbed, Martha Hastings said, tears streaming down her face, Jane made me promise to tell someone the truth if Thomas Whitmore ever hurt another girl. She said she hadn't been his first victim, and she wouldn't be his last. She begged me to protect whoever came after her, but I didn't know how. He was a respected businessman, and Jane was a dead housemaid with no family to advocate for her. Who would have listened to my accusations? Who would have cared? I've carried that guilt ever since. Henderson took detailed statements from both Robert and Martha Hastings, documenting everything they knew about Jane Burton's time in Whitmore's household. He also tracked down the doctor who had treated Jane in her final illness. The physician, Dr. Simmons, confirmed that the girl had been suffering from a septic condition consistent with a botched abortion attempt, and that in her delirium, she had spoken repeatedly about a man named Thomas who had ruined her. But the investigation went further still. Armed with this information, Henderson began searching for other women who might have worked in Whitmore's household before his marriage to Catherine. He discovered 2 more former servants, both of whom had left Ashford and established lives elsewhere. When approached carefully and promised discretion, both women confirmed that they had experienced inappropriate attention from Thomas Whitmore during their employment. One, a woman named Emily Carter, who now worked as a seamstress in a neighboring county, described a pattern of behavior identical to what Jane Burton and later Eleanor had experienced: the surveillance, the late-night visits, the insistence on private meetings, the veiled threats wrapped in language about gratitude and duty. "I was lucky," Emily said bitterly. "I was able to leave before it went as far as it went with poor Jane, but I knew what he was, and I knew he wouldn't stop." Men like him never stop. They believe their position gives them the right to take whatever they want from those beneath them, and society agrees with them. The law protects them, not us. The second woman, who refused to give her name but provided a sworn statement through an intermediary, described an assault that had occurred in Whitmore's warehouse office. She had gone there to deliver a message from his household and had been trapped alone with him. Afterward, she had fled the position without even collecting the wages owed to her, too terrified and ashamed to take any formal action. "I heard he got married," she told the intermediary. "I prayed for his wife and any daughters she might have. I knew what he would do to them, eventually." Men like him always turn their attention to the women they have the most control over. This cascade of revelations transformed the public understanding of the case completely. Thomas Whitmore was no longer a stern but respectable merchant who had died under mysterious circumstances. He was now exposed as a serial predator who had used his position of authority to prey upon vulnerable women for years, possibly decades. The locked parlor where he had died was not the scene of a simple domestic dispute, but the final confrontation in a long history of abuse. The newspapers, which had been cautiously balanced in their coverage, now wrote with barely contained outrage. The Ashford Chronicle published a blistering editorial. "We stand appalled at the revelations that have emerged about the late Thomas Whitmore. Here was a man who hid his predatory nature behind a facade of respectability, who used the very structures of law and society that should protect the vulnerable as weapons to silence his victims. Jane Burton is dead. Who knows how many others suffered at his hands? And now we understand that Miss Eleanor Whitmore was not a cold-blooded murderess, but a desperate young woman who saw no escape from a monster wearing her stepfather's face. The question before us now is not whether she caused his death. That seems increasingly certain. The question is whether we, as a society, can find the moral courage to say that she was justified in doing so." But not everyone agreed. Conservative voices argued that revealing Whitmore's past behavior, however deplorable, did not justify murder. The law, they insisted, must remain blind to sympathy and enforce its prohibitions against taking human life, regardless of the victim's character. To do otherwise would be to invite chaos and vigilante justice. If we allow Miss Whitmore to escape punishment because her stepfather was a scoundrel, wrote one correspondent to the local paper, we set a dangerous precedent. Anyone who commits murder might then claim their victim deserved death for some past sin. The law must remain objective and unbending, or it ceases to be law at all. These arguments had a certain logical consistency to them, but they failed to grapple with the fundamental problem at the heart of the case. What justice could the law have provided to Eleanor Whitmore before her stepfather's death? She could not have gone to the authorities with complaints about his behavior. Such complaints from women about men in their own households were rarely taken seriously, and even if believed, would have resulted in no meaningful action. She could not have left his household. She had no means of support and no legal right to remove herself from his guardianship. She could not have defended herself through any legitimate channel. The law had offered her no protection, no recourse, no escape. And now that same law was preparing to judge her for taking the only action that seemed to offer survival. It was a grotesque circularity that exposed the profound injustice embedded in the legal and social structures of Victorian England. Dr. Harrington, the coroner, found himself in an impossible position. The evidence was overwhelming that Thomas Whitmore had been a predatory abuser with multiple victims. It was equally clear that Eleanor Whitmore had killed him, whether through deliberate planning or through a desperate struggle. But how could he, as an officer of the court, reconcile these facts with the law as it existed? When the inquest reconvened to hear the new evidence about Whitmore's history, the atmosphere in the courtroom was electric with tension. Eleanor was brought back to testify, and this time the questions were different. "Miss Whitmore, Doctor," Harrington asked, "you have heard the testimony about your stepfather's treatment of servants in his household before his marriage to your mother. Did you have any knowledge of this history?" "No," Eleanor replied. "I knew nothing about Jane Burton or the others until the investigation revealed their stories, but I am not surprised. The moment I learned what he had done to them, everything made sense. His behavior toward me was not an aberration. It was a pattern, one he had refined over years of practice." Can you now describe for this court, in your own words, what occurred in the parlor on the morning of October 17th? Eleanor was silent for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, it was with a clarity and strength that had been absent from her earlier testimony. "He had called me to the parlor that morning, saying he needed to discuss the upcoming trip to London. When I entered, he locked the door behind me. He told me that I needed to understand my position, that I owed him everything, that my mother and I would be destitute without him, that he had been patient long enough." Her voice remained steady as she continued. "He put his hands on my shoulders, then moved them to my neck. He said he could feel my pulse racing, that he knew I was afraid, and that I needed to learn to submit to him properly. I told him no. I tried to move away, but he gripped my arms. Those are likely the bruises the doctor noted. I struggled, and in the struggle, he lost his balance and struck his head against the mantelpiece. And after he fell, he was disoriented, dazed. He tried to stand, reaching for me again. I picked up the fireplace poker. I didn't plan. I simply knew I couldn't allow him to touch me again. He lunged toward me and I struck him. He fell, hit his head on the floor, and didn't move again." It was a clear admission of causing death, but in the context now surrounding it, was it murder? Was it self-defense? Was it justified homicide? The law provided no clear answer because the law had never seriously contemplated such a situation. The inquest jury, those 12 men of property and standing, faced a decision that would define them as much as it would determine Alina's fate. They could apply the letter of the law and return a verdict of murder, sending this young woman to trial and likely to the gallows. Or they could acknowledge the broader context and find some way to provide mercy within the constraints of Victorian justice. As Alina was led from the courtroom to await the verdict, she looked less like a prisoner than a ghost, someone who had already departed from the world of the living and was merely waiting for the formality of her physical departure. Whatever the jury decided, it seemed clear that Alina Whitmore had already paid a terrible price for her survival. The only question was whether society would demand she pay more. The jury deliberated for 2 days, an unusually long time for an inquest, which typically reached its conclusions within hours. The extended deliberation suggested profound disagreement among the jurors, a struggle to reconcile their legal obligations with their moral understanding of the case. During those 2 days, Ashford held its collective breath. The outcome of this verdict would reveal something fundamental about the town's character, and perhaps about Victorian society's capacity for mercy in the face of circumstances that defied simple judgment. When the jury finally filed back into the courtroom, their faces showed the strain of their deliberations. The foreman, a middle-aged solicitor named Mr. Pemberton, coincidentally, the husband of the neighbor who had first raised the alarm, stood to deliver their verdict with visible reluctance. Dr. Harrington, in his role as coroner, asked the formal question, "Has the jury reached a determination regarding the death of Thomas Whitmore?" "We have, sir," Pemberton replied, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was about to say. "And what is your verdict as to the cause and manner of death?" Pemberton glanced down at the paper in his hand, though it was clear he had memorized the words. "The jury finds that Thomas Whitmore died as a result of cranial trauma sustained during a physical altercation in his home on the morning of October 17, 1850. We further find that Miss Alina Whitmore was responsible for causing the injuries that led to his death." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. This was the finding that everyone had expected, but the second part of the verdict would be crucial. The jury had to determine whether the death should be classified as murder, manslaughter, or justifiable homicide. Pemberton continued, clearly choosing his words with great care. "However, after considering all the testimony and evidence presented, including the documented history of the deceased's predatory behavior toward women in his household, and considering the immediate circumstances in which the altercation occurred, the jury cannot find that Miss Whitmore acted with malice aforethought or criminal intent. We find instead that she acted in defense of her person against an imminent threat of grievous harm." The courtroom erupted. Half the gallery seemed to be shouting in approval, while the other half voiced objections. Dr. Harrington had to call for order several times before he could continue the proceedings. "Mr. Pemberton, are you saying the jury finds this to be justifiable homicide?" "We are, sir, though we acknowledge this finding is reached with considerable difficulty, given the limitations of current law in addressing such circumstances." The legal implications of this verdict were staggering. By finding Alina's actions to be justifiable self-defense, the jury was essentially declaring that she should face no criminal prosecution for her stepfather's death. But they were also, whether intentionally or not, making a broader statement about the rights of women to protect themselves from predatory men, even when those men held legal authority over them. The verdict should have ended Alina's legal jeopardy, but it immediately sparked controversy that would extend far beyond Ashford. The Crown prosecutor, upon reviewing the inquest findings, expressed serious concerns about allowing such a verdict to stand unchallenged. There were calls for Alina to be charged with murder regardless of the inquest's conclusion, to let a full criminal trial determine her fate. The case had become too significant, too public, to be resolved quietly at the local level. After several weeks of deliberation, the Crown made its decision. Eleanor Whitmore would be formally charged with manslaughter, a compromise position that acknowledged the extenuating circumstances while still insisting that she face criminal judgment for taking a life. The trial was scheduled for the winter assizes, when a circuit judge would preside over serious criminal cases in the county. The months between the inquest and the trial were agonizing for all involved. Eleanor was released on bail, thanks to funds raised by sympathetic supporters who had been moved by her story. She returned to her mother's home. The house on Harrington Street had been sold, unable to find a buyer who wasn't disturbed by its dark history. Mother and daughter lived in a small rented cottage on the outskirts of town, neither quite ostracized nor truly welcomed by their neighbors. The case had divided Ashford, and increasingly, much of England into two camps. The emerging women's rights movement, still in its early stages in 1850, seized upon Eleanor's case as emblematic of women's powerlessness under the law. Public meetings were held, pamphlets were distributed, and editorials were written arguing that Eleanor Whitmore was not a criminal, but a victim who had been forced to choose between submission and survival. "The law," wrote one activist, "has proven itself to be an instrument of oppression rather than protection. It guards men's authority over their households with zealous fervor, while offering no shield whatsoever to the women and children who suffer abuse behind those jealously protected doors. If Eleanor Whitmore hangs for defending herself, then we declare to every woman in England that you have no right to your own body, no right to resist those who would violate you, no recourse but to suffer in silence until death provides your only escape." Conservative voices pushed back hard against this rhetoric, seeing in it a dangerous challenge to the fundamental ordering of society. "The family is the bedrock of civilization," argued one clergyman in a widely circulated sermon, "and the family requires hierarchy and authority to function. The authority of a father or husband over his household is ordained by God and essential to social order. To allow women to use violence against men in their families, even in circumstances of alleged wrongdoing, is to invite the complete dissolution of family structure and the chaos that would inevitably follow." What neither side adequately addressed was the impossible bind in which Eleanor and women like her found themselves, expected to submit to male authority, even when that authority was exercised in ways that violated their humanity, yet condemned if they defended themselves when the institutions that should have protected them offered no assistance. The trial itself, when it finally began in January of 1851, was a spectacle that drew observers from across the country. The courthouse in the county seat was packed beyond capacity, with hundreds of people standing outside in the cold winter air, hoping for news of the proceedings. Inside, the prosecution and defense prepared to wage battle over questions that extended far beyond the specific facts of one man's death. The prosecution's strategy was to separate the act from its context. Yes, Thomas Whitmore had been a man of questionable character. Yes, he had behaved inappropriately toward women in his household. But on the morning of October 17th, Eleanor Whitmore had struck him with a fireplace poker, causing injuries that led to his death. That action, the prosecution argued, constituted manslaughter regardless of what had preceded it. "The law cannot allow individuals to become judges and executioners," the prosecutor declared in his opening statement. "If we accept that Miss Whitmore was justified in killing her stepfather because of his inappropriate behavior, where does that principle end? Could a servant kill an employer who mistreated them? Could a tenant kill a landlord who exploited them? Could anyone who felt wronged take the law into their own hands and expect society to condone their violence? This is not justice, it is anarchy. The defense took a different approach, one that was radical for its time. Eleanor's barrister, a London solicitor named Mr. James Hartley, who had taken the case for a nominal fee out of genuine belief in its importance, argued that the law's failure to protect women like Eleanor created a situation where self-defense was not just justified but necessary for survival. "Gentlemen of the jury," Hartley said in his opening, "we will prove to you that Thomas Whitmore was not a respectable man whose stepdaughter inexplicably turned violent. He was a predator who had left a trail of victims in his wake, a man who used the shield of respectability and the law's indifference to women's suffering to pursue his depravity without consequence. We will show you that on the morning of his death, he was attempting to commit an assault upon Miss Whitmore that would have destroyed her utterly. And we will ask you to consider whether the law can truly demand that a young woman submit to such violation rather than defend herself, simply because her attacker held legal authority over her." The trial lasted 5 days, with testimony that largely rehashed what had emerged during the inquest, but with even more detail and even more emotional impact. The servants testified again about the atmosphere in the Whitmore household. The Hastings family traveled to recount Jane Burton's tragic story. Eleanor herself took the stand, and for the first time provided a full and detailed account of the 3 years she had lived under Thomas Whitmore's roof. Her testimony was devastating. She described in painful detail the progression of his behavior, from uncomfortable attention to inappropriate touching to explicit statements about what he intended to do to her. She recounted the night he had first entered her room uninvited, the terror she had felt, the slow erosion of any sense of safety or autonomy. And she described the final confrontation in the parlor, when she had realized that his patience, as he called it, had reached its end. "I knew that if I went to London with him, if I was alone with him in a hotel room for 3 nights, there would be no coming back from what would happen," Eleanor testified. "I would be ruined, whether anyone else ever knew or not. I would have to live with the knowledge of what he had done to me, what I had been too powerless to prevent. And I realized, standing in that parlor with his hands on me, that I would rather die or kill than allow that to happen." The prosecution, in cross-examination, tried to establish that Eleanor had planned to kill her stepfather, that the diary entries proved premeditation, but Eleanor held firm to her account. "I wished him dead," she acknowledged. "I cannot deny that, but wishing and planning are different things. What happened in the parlor was not the execution of a plan. It was a desperate struggle by someone who saw no other path to survival." The judge's instructions to the jury were necessarily complex, trying to navigate the tension between the letter of the law and the extraordinary circumstances of the case. "You must determine," he told the jurors, "whether Miss Whitmore's actions constituted manslaughter, which requires that she caused death through an unlawful act or through negligence, or whether her actions were justified by the principle of self-defense, which permits the use of reasonable force to prevent imminent harm to one's person." The crucial question, he explained, was whether Eleanor's perception of imminent harm was reasonable, and whether her response, using a fireplace poker to strike her stepfather, was proportionate to that threat. "You may consider all the circumstances you have heard, including the history of the deceased's behavior and the defendant's state of mind, in determining whether her actions were reasonable under the circumstances she faced." The jury deliberated for 18 hours, through the night and into the next day. When they finally returned, they looked as exhausted and conflicted as the inquest jury had been months earlier. The verdict: not guilty of manslaughter by reason of self-defense. Eleanor Whitmore was free. The verdict sent shockwaves through Victorian England. Newspapers from London to Edinburgh debated its implications. Had justice been served, or had sentiment overtaken law? More fundamentally, what did this verdict mean for the relationship between men's authority and women's rights within the household? For Alina herself, the verdict brought legal freedom but not peace. She was 20 years old when the trial ended, but she looked far older, aged by trauma and public scrutiny. The notoriety made it impossible for her to remain in Ashford or anywhere nearby. She had become too famous, too symbolic, too burdened with meaning that extended beyond her individual personhood. What became of Alina Whitmore in the years after her acquittal remains somewhat unclear, obscured by time and the deliberate efforts of those who helped her escape her notoriety. Some accounts suggest she emigrated to America, where she could build a life free from the whispers and stares that followed her in England. Others claim she changed her name and moved to a remote part of Scotland, living quietly under an assumed identity. A few insist she entered a religious order, seeking solace in devotion after the horrors she had endured. Her mother, Catherine, lived for another 15 years after the trial. She never remarried, never spoke publicly about her second husband or her daughter's ordeal. She lived in increasing poverty, the widow's portion from Thomas Whitmore's estate having been minimal and quickly exhausted. Some former neighbors sent her occasional assistance, anonymous donations that appeared on her doorstep. Others believed she had enabled her daughter's supposed crime and treated her with cold disdain. She died in 1866, and her gravestone bore only her name and dates, no mention of the relationships that had defined and destroyed her life. The house on Harrington Street, where Thomas Whitmore had died, stood empty for nearly 2 years before a buyer could be found. When it was finally sold, it was at a fraction of its previous value. The new owner, a family from out of the area who claimed not to know its history, moved in with optimism that quickly curdled. They reported strange occurrences, doors that locked from the inside without explanation, cold spots in certain rooms regardless of season, sounds of weeping that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Whether these phenomena were genuine hauntings, the products of imagination influenced by knowledge of the house's past, or simply the creaking and settling of an old building, the result was the same. The house gained a reputation as cursed, tainted by the violence and suffering that had occurred within its walls. Tenants came and went with unusual rapidity. By the 1870s, the house had fallen into disrepair, too stigmatized to command the rent necessary to maintain it. It was eventually condemned and demolished in 1883, the lot remaining empty for decades afterward. But the true legacy of the Whitmore case was not architectural, it was social and legal. The trial and its verdict became a touchstone in the emerging debate about women's rights and legal protections. Reformers pointed to Alina's case as proof that existing laws were inadequate to protect vulnerable women, and that fundamental changes were necessary. In the decades following the trial, small but significant reforms began to emerge. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 made divorce more accessible, though still extraordinarily difficult for women to obtain. The Married Women's Property Acts of the 1870s and 1880s gradually gave married women rights to own property and control their own earnings. Legal reforms began, slowly and incompletely, to recognize that women were individuals with rights, not merely property of their husbands or fathers. These changes came far too late for Alina Whitmore, for Jane Burton, for the unnamed women whom Thomas Whitmore had victimized. But their suffering was not entirely without meaning. The Whitmore case, publicized and debated across the country, had forced Victorian England to confront truths about domestic abuse, sexual predation, and women's powerlessness that it desperately wanted to ignore. The case also established, however tentatively and controversially, a legal principle that women had a right to defend themselves from sexual assault, even when the attacker was a family member who held legal authority over them. This was a radical notion in 1851, one that would be challenged and contested repeatedly in subsequent years. But the precedent had been set, and it could not be entirely erased. In the archives of county court records, stored in boxes that few researchers ever examine, lie the documents of Eleanor Whitmore's trial, testimony transcripts, legal briefs, the judge's instructions to the jury. These papers tell a story that Victorian England tried to forget, a story about the hidden violence behind respectable facades, and about a young woman who chose survival even when the cost was unimaginably high. And in that choice, in that desperate act of self-preservation, Eleanor Whitmore became something more than an individual. She became a symbol of women's suffering under patriarchal authority, of the failure of law to protect the vulnerable, of the moral complexity that exists in situations where all options lead to harm. Her story asks questions that remain relevant far beyond the Victorian era. What do we owe to those who are trapped by the very systems that should protect them? When the law offers no recourse, no escape, no justice, can we condemn those who take desperate measures to survive? And what does it say about a society when individuals must choose between submission to abuse and the commission of violence? These questions haunted Victorian England in the aftermath of the Whitmore trial. They haunt us still. The fog that had shrouded Ashford on the morning of October 17, 1850, when Thomas Whitmore's body was discovered, never quite lifted from the town's collective memory. Decades after the trial, elderly residents would still speak of that case in hushed tones, some with sympathy for Eleanor, others with lingering disapproval, but all with a sense that something fundamental had been exposed that could never be completely covered over again. In 1892, more than 40 years after the trial, a researcher named Miss Adelaide Price was conducting a study on women's criminality for a progressive social reform organization. She attempted to track down what had become of Eleanor Whitmore, to interview her if possible, and include her perspective in the research. What Price discovered was a carefully constructed wall of silence. No death certificate could be found for Eleanor Whitmore in England. No marriage license under that name appeared in any registry. Immigration records were incomplete for the period, but no definitive evidence of her departure to America or the colonies could be established. It was as though Eleanor had simply vanished, deliberately erasing herself from all official documentation. Price did, however, find something intriguing. In a remote village in the Scottish Highlands, there lived a woman named Helen Morris who ran a small school for girls. She was approximately the right age, and local gossip suggested she had appeared in the area around 1852, shortly after the Whitmore trial, with sufficient funds to establish herself but no clear history. The woman was described as reserved but kind, dedicated to her students, and particularly focused on teaching girls self-reliance and the importance of protecting themselves. Price traveled to Scotland to interview this Helen Morris, but the woman refused to see her. She sent a message through an intermediary. The past should remain buried. Tell those who wonder that she found peace in anonymity and useful work. That is all anyone needs to know. Whether Helen Morris was indeed Eleanor Whitmore, or whether Eleanor found some other refuge far from the scenes of her suffering, will likely never be known with certainty. Perhaps that anonymity was its own form of justice, the freedom to be someone other than the girl whose stepfather had made her notorious, the woman whose private tragedy had become public spectacle. But Eleanor's story lived on in ways she could never have anticipated. The Whitmore case was cited in subsequent legal proceedings involving domestic violence. It appeared in the arguments of suffragettes campaigning for women's voting rights, used as evidence of why women needed political power to protect themselves from predatory men. It was referenced in parliamentary debates about legal reforms protecting women and children. Eleanor herself might have disappeared, but the impact of her case resonated through the decades. The house that once stood on Harrington Street became the subject of local ghost stories told to frighten children and entertain tourists. Tales were spun about the merchant who had met a violent end and the stepdaughter who had killed him. Most of these stories bore little resemblance to the actual events. They focused on the violence and the haunting, stripping away the context that had made the case so morally complex. The real horror of what had occurred there, the months of psychological torment, the predatory behavior, the complete powerlessness of a young woman trapped with no escape, was gradually forgotten, replaced by simpler narratives of crime and punishment. By the early 20th century, the Whitmore case had faded from public consciousness, remembered only by historians with particular interests in Victorian criminality or women's legal history. The questions it had raised about domestic authority, sexual abuse, and women's right to self-defense were being addressed, slowly, incompletely, but addressed nonetheless, through legal and social reforms that Eleanor could never have imagined. But in another sense, those questions remain unresolved even today. How do we balance the rule of law with the recognition that some situations defy simple legal categories? How do we address abuses of power that occur in private spaces, behind closed doors, where victims have little recourse? How do we create systems of justice that protect the vulnerable rather than merely reinforcing the authority of the powerful? Eleanor Whitmore faced these questions in their rawest, most desperate form. She lived in an era that offered her no protection, no justice, no escape except through an act that society condemned even as it had tolerated, or ignored, the behavior that drove her to it. Her choice to defend herself, to strike back against her predator, even knowing the consequences she would face, required a courage that most people will never need to summon. Whether we call her a victim, a survivor, or something more complicated still, Eleanor Whitmore's story demands that we confront uncomfortable truths. It reminds us that respectability can mask monstrous behavior, that legal authority and moral authority are not the same thing, that sometimes the greatest crimes are those committed within the family, where the law has historically been most reluctant to intrude. And that survival, for those trapped in impossible situations, can require desperate measures that society is unprepared to judge fairly. The fog over Ashford on that October morning in 1850 eventually lifted, revealing the body in the parlor and the beginning of a case that would shake Victorian certainties. But in a deeper sense, the fog remains, the fog of ambiguity that surrounds questions of justice when law, morality, and survival collide in ways that defy simple answers. Eleanor Whitmore disappears into that fog, lost to history's certain knowledge but preserved in its questions. Her story doesn't offer resolution or closure. It offers instead a challenge to think more deeply about justice, about power, about the hidden violence that still occurs behind respectable facades, and about what we owe to those who are trapped with no good options. In the end, perhaps that uncertainty, that refusal of simple answers, is the most honest conclusion we can reach. Eleanor Whitmore's crime, if we call it that, was born from another's crimes against her. Her violence emerged from systemic violence that law and society permitted to flourish unchecked. And her fate, whatever it ultimately was, reflected a justice system struggling to address circumstances it was fundamentally unprepared to understand. How many other daughters' crimes remain hidden in history, buried in archives, or never recorded at all? How many other women faced similar impossible choices, with no Eleanor Whitmore trial to give their suffering visibility or meaning. How many suffered in silence, submitted to abuse, or took desperate measures that were never understood in their full context? These questions echo across time, from the foggy streets of Victorian Ashford to our own era, which likes to believe it has left such injustices behind, but continues to grapple with domestic violence, sexual abuse, and the inadequacy of legal systems to protect the vulnerable. Eleanor Whitmore's ghost, whether literal or metaphorical, still haunts us, demanding that we do better, see more clearly, and recognize that sometimes the real crime is not the violence committed by the desperate, but the violence that made them desperate in the first place. The secret behind the stepfather's death was never really a secret at all. It was hidden in plain sight, protected by social conventions that valued men's authority over women's suffering, by a legal system that prioritized order over justice, and by a collective willingness to ignore what occurred behind the closed doors of respectable households. Eleanor Whitmore's act of killing her stepfather tore away that concealment, forcing everyone who examined her case to see what they had preferred to ignore. And in that exposure, in that refusal to remain a silent victim, she achieved something that transcended her individual survival. She made visible the invisible. She made audible the silence that had protected men like Thomas Whitmore for generations. That visibility, that voice, is her true legacy, more lasting than any verdict, more meaningful than any legal precedent. Eleanor Whitmore refused to die quietly, either literally or figuratively. And in that refusal, she speaks still to everyone who has ever been trapped, ever been powerless, ever faced the terrible choice between submission and survival. Her story does not end with resolution, because such stories never truly end. They echo forward through time, asking each generation the same uncomfortable questions. What would you do? How far would you go to survive? And when the institutions that should protect you offer no help, what becomes justifiable? The daughter's crime and the secret behind the stepfather's death are, finally, the same thing: a truth about power, abuse, and the desperate measures taken by those who have no other choice. It is a secret that Victorian England tried to keep, a truth that made everyone uncomfortable then and makes us uncomfortable still. But discomfort, perhaps, is precisely what Eleanor Whitmore's story should provoke. Comfortable stories ask nothing of us. They confirm what we already believe and demand no moral struggle. Eleanor's story does the opposite. It forces us to grapple with moral complexity, with situations where every option is tainted, where law and justice diverge, and where our sympathies must wrestle with our principles. And so her story remains, recorded in fading documents and remembered in ghostly whispers, refusing to be forgotten, refusing to be simplified, refusing to release us from the questions it raises. In that refusal lies its power, and perhaps its purpose. Some stories survive not because they provide answers, but because they ask questions too important to be left behind. Eleanor Whitmore's question echoes still, across more than 170 years, from that fog-shrouded morning when a stepfather's body was found and a daughter's long ordeal finally, violently ended, when survival requires violence, and law offers no protection. Where does justice truly lie? It is a question each generation must answer for itself. And until we build a world where such questions need never be asked, Eleanor Whitmore's ghost will continue to haunt us, a reminder of what happened when authority became tyranny, when respectability masked predation, and when one young woman chose to fight rather than submit. The fog over Ashford has long since cleared, but the fog around justice, mercy, and the rights of the powerless remains, waiting for the sunlight of true understanding to finally, completely, burn it away.